My revenge wasn't about sending them to prison. It was about destroying the one thing my ex-wife Sarah and her new husband Mark valued more than anything else: their flawless, fabricated reputation. And I did it at their own Christmas party, handing Mark a gift that eventually cost him millions. It started with a single phone call, 2 weeks before Christmas. My daughter Amy was 17, and the holiday tradition we'd built since the divorce, spending Christmas Eve with me and Christmas Day morning with my parents, was sacred. I picked up, ready for her excited rundown of her wish list, but her voice was flat, almost mechanical. "Dad," she said, "I'm not coming this year. Mom and Mark are taking me to the Caribbean for the whole week. It just came up." It wasn't the words that hurt, it was the delivery. It sounded rehearsed, like reading a press release. The sudden total cancellation wasn't just a change of plans, it felt like a declaration of ownership. When I broke the news to my own parents, Amy's grandparents, the look on my mother's face was devastating. It wasn't just a canceled dinner, it was the final brutal cut in a custody battle that had ended years ago, only to be resurrected and fought with Mark's infinite bank account as the weapon. My father just quietly walked out to the garage. They knew, and I knew, this wasn't Amy's decision. This was Sarah flexing her financial muscle. If you are a fan of true stories about betrayal, hidden plots, and the perfect cold-blooded execution of revenge, then you've come to the right place. Hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next twist in this incredible true story. We're just getting started. The immediate shock quickly burned away, replaced by an icy, focused clarity. My ex Sarah had always been manipulative, but this was a new low. Mark, the real estate mogul she married, had become her ultimate tool of spite. Why compete with me on quality time or emotional connection when you could simply buy the loyalty of a teenager with a promise of luxury and freedom? I started connecting the dots immediately. The trip was just the visible tip of the iceberg. I remembered overhearing a snippet of a conversation Amy had weeks before about a substantial college prep stipend that Mark was supposedly funding. Now it made perfect sense. The stipend wasn't for college preparation. It was a retainer fee. She was being paid to cut me out. The price of Amy's affection, her presence at Christmas, was being silently dictated by a man who bought and sold everything, including, apparently, my family traditions. I looked at the framed photo of Amy, 7 years old, beaming next to a slightly lopsided Christmas tree I'd decorated myself. The sting of betrayal was overwhelming, but it didn't paralyze me. Instead, it fueled a resolve colder than any winter snow. I decided then and there that Mark and Sarah's operation was highly vulnerable, and I wasn't just going to get Amy back. I was going to dismantle their entire foundation of false superiority. This wasn't going to be messy or emotional. This was going to be a business transaction of pure surgical payback. The first step was to confirm my suspicions about the cash flow. I needed evidence that Mark was leveraging his financial power directly to alienate Amy from me. I decided to forgo a direct, angry confrontation. That was exactly what Sarah wanted, for me to lose my temper, validate her narrative that I was unstable and broke, and push Amy further into her lavish, false security. Instead, I called the best private investigator I knew. Not to spy on Amy, obviously, but to dig deep into Mark's financial history. A man who acquires wealth that quickly and uses it with such cold, calculated cruelty always leaves digital tracks. I wasn't looking for a messy personal secret. I was looking for the corporate Achilles heel. I needed leverage that could only be activated in a business setting, something that would resonate with his investors and the society he desperately courted. The game had changed from a family dispute into a high-stakes corporate maneuver, and I was about to prove that an average guy with nothing left to lose is far more dangerous than any millionaire who thinks he's untouchable. I wasn't waiting for Christmas to arrive. I was waiting for the intel. My guy Leo was a genius with digital forensics. He specialized in finding the paper trail of people who thought they were too smart for paper trails. I gave him a clear directive. Forget the messy divorce stuff, I need Mark's corporate ledger. I need to know where the money for Amy's stipend and the sudden Caribbean trip is coming from, and if it's clean enough to withstand public scrutiny. My goal wasn't legal prosecution, it was reputational suicide. Leo's work was quick and clinical. Within 3 days, he provided me with a thick file. It wasn't about textbook fraud on a grand scale that was too visible for Mark, but a clear pattern of what Leo called creative asset management. This involved using a complex web of offshore shell companies, not just for tax mitigation, which is common among the ultra wealthy, but for deliberately obscuring the true value and ownership of certain high risk real estate developments. It was all technically legal on the surface, but only if you didn't look too closely at the intent. The intent, however, was highly questionable and potentially disastrous if exposed to his major investors and the banking institutions who backed him. This was not Mark's complete downfall, but it was a magnificent starting point for leveraging his reputation. It showed a systemic lack of transparency and a willingness to operate in the gray areas of high finance. More importantly, Leo confirmed my gut feeling about Amy. The college prep stipend was anything but altruistic. It was a substantial monthly allowance, discreetly transferred from one of Mark's holding companies directly into a new educational trust fund Sarah had set up for Amy. The terms of the trust were the real kicker, a masterclass in psychological manipulation disguised as legal boilerplate. There was an obscure yet legally sound clause stating that if Amy spent more than 20 total days per calendar year in the exclusive company of any party deemed detrimental to her academic focus, a category Sarah had conveniently slipped me into during the drafting, the monthly distribution would be temporarily suspended. They had literally formalized the process of buying her away from me. The Caribbean trip? It was the incentive, a massive bonus payment in the form of an expense-paid luxury cruise, a reward for successfully executing the first phase of the Christmas boycott. This revelation didn't ignite a fiery rage in me. It produced a deadly, focused calm. They had chosen the battlefield and the weapon, money talks. But Mark had fundamentally failed to realize that when you make your entire public image dependent on a facade of impeccable wealth and legitimacy, you create a massive surface area for attack. He was a house of cards built on clever but traceable accounting tricks, and all it would take was one perfectly timed, highly publicized gust of wind to collapse the entire structure. I now knew the what and the why. The next crucial step was the confrontation outlined in my plan. Not to win the argument, but to gather the final piece of tactical intelligence. Sarah's unwavering arrogance. I needed her to confirm in person how high she thought she stood, because the higher they stood, the harder they would fall. The fight had officially moved from a painful family spat to a calculated, high-stakes corporate maneuver. I wasn't a sad, broken father anymore. I was a strategist. And the final fatal gift I was preparing for Mark was already being wrapped. I tracked Sarah down at an exhibition opening for some new abstract artist in a downtown gallery. It was the perfect stage for her. Expensive wine, tailored clothes, and people she desperately needed to impress with her proximity to Mark's money. I approached her not with fury, but with a mask of forced diplomacy. I needed her to believe I was desperate for a truce, begging for one last chance to salvage the remnants of our family's Christmas tradition. She barely glanced up from her conversation with a woman who looked equally self-important, her eyes already scanning the room for someone more relevant. "Look who decided to crawl out of the woodwork," she drawled, taking a slow, performative sip of champagne. Her voice was laced with patronizing pity. I cut straight to the point, my tone even, almost apologetic. I asked about Amy and the sudden, complete commitment to the Caribbean trip, feigning confusion over the abruptness. Her smile widened, cold and predatory. This was the exact moment she had been waiting for. She dismissed my feelings completely, waving her hand dismissively as if shooing away a bothersome insect. Amy is maturing, Mike. She understands what true success looks like. I can offer her experiences, opportunities, a future that you simply can't afford. This isn't about me, she lied, her eyes glittering with triumph. It's about giving her the level of life she deserves. She was gloating, confirming every detail of the financial coercion. She saw Amy's decision not as a choice, but as a victory bought and paid for with Mark's immense yet slightly shady wealth. She then leaned in, lowering her voice just enough to ensure only I heard the final crushing blow. Stop clinging to those pathetic family rituals. They're boring, frankly. Mark provides stability. He's teaching her real world value. Face it, you lost. You lost Amy's Christmas, and you lost the right to dictate her life when you couldn't keep up with the cost of admission. The words were designed to obliterate my spirit, to reduce me to the broke, irrelevant ex husband she always painted me to be. But this time, the venom didn't paralyze me, it solidified my resolve. I looked at her, truly looked, and saw not a triumphant rival, but a shallow, financially intoxicated puppet of Mark's ego. I realized that her entire identity was now tied to Mark's perceived infallibility and his untouchable status. I nodded slowly, a ghost of a smile touching my lips. My silence confused her. She had expected rage, tears, or pleading. All she got was a calm, almost surgical response. Duly noted, Sarah. Thank you for clarifying the terms of your engagement with Amy. Merry Christmas. I turned and walked away, leaving her stranded in the middle of her glittering crowd, clearly baffled by my lack of reaction. The sting of the humiliation was intense, but it served its purpose perfectly. She had just provided the psychological cornerstone for my revenge, her unshakable, arrogant belief that they were invincible and that I was utterly irrelevant. That overconfidence was the massive, gaping crack in their fortress. Now, I just needed to start the clock on their self-destruction. My next move had to be invisible, making them believe the threat was coming from within their own trusted circle. The humiliation at the gallery was the last emotional hurdle. Now it was just strategy. My focus shifted entirely to Mark. Sarah was a side character. Mark was the architect of the financial bribery, and he was the target. His empire, built on creative asset management, was strong, but every fortress has a weak point, usually where the architect felt too secure to bother with proper fortification. I doubled down with Leo, my private investigator. I told him to stop looking for outright crime and start looking for vulnerability. Mark's high-profile real estate developments were primarily funded by institutional investors and large banks, entities terrified of reputational risk and lack of transparency. Leo quickly identified a handful of projects in emerging markets where Mark had used complex cross-border shell structures to manage liability and conceal profit margins from local tax authorities. Again, nothing strictly illegal enough for an immediate police investigation, but deeply unethical and certainly enough to make a major bank instantly pull its credit line. The most damning detail was a massive development in Southeast Asia. Mark had effectively used a local partner as a fall guy, setting up the contract so that if the local market experienced a downturn, which it was currently doing, the local partner would absorb the massive losses, while Mark's holding company would legally walk away clean, having already extracted substantial management fees. This was the skeleton I needed. It proved a pattern of callous disregard for partners and a willingness to destroy others to protect his own bottom line. If his high-end, image-conscious Western investors knew he routinely behaved like a financial parasite, their trust, and more importantly, their funding, would evaporate. This wasn't just about financial loss. It was about public image. Mark spent millions cultivating the persona of a visionary, a man who lifts markets. Exposing this scheme would reveal him as a corporate predator. I made Leo gather and synthesize this data into a comprehensive, irrefutable narrative. I didn't want raw documents. I wanted a story, a detailed and easily digestible article that laid out the chronological sequence of his shady dealings, citing only publicly available but hard to find records and anonymously sourced contractual evidence. I decided to call this narrative the Mark of Misdirection. It needed to be written with an air of objective, detached financial journalism, devoid of my personal grievances, making it look like the work of a professional investigative journalist who had stumbled upon a complex financial conspiracy. I ensured that all the information I had could not be directly traced back to me or my access. My ultimate goal wasn't to leak everything at once. The genius of the revenge had to be in the timing and the delivery. I was preparing the poison, but I would serve it in the most public, most humiliating way possible, at the climax of their social calendar. My preparation was meticulous, focusing on how to maximize the audience's attention on their downfall, ensuring that when the truth hit, it wouldn't be a whisper, but a seismic shock that would shake the foundations of Mark's carefully constructed empire. My internal clock was ticking down to Christmas Eve. My revenge required a theatrical element, misdirection. Mark and Sarah needed to spend the weeks leading up to Christmas, looking over their shoulders, terrified that their own close circle was turning against them. They couldn't, for a second, suspect the irrelevant, broke ex-husband they had just humiliated. I needed them to cannibalize their own trust. Leo's team, operating under strict anonymity, began executing a series of controlled leaks. We didn't leak the Mark of Misdirection article yet. Instead, we leaked highly specific, non-public details about Mark's smaller, perfectly legitimate side deals, deals only a handful of senior partners and one or two trusted associates knew about. The information wasn't damaging, but the source of the leak was terrifyingly precise. We used anonymous drop accounts and burner phones to send vague, unsettling messages to two of Mark's most competitive colleagues, subtly suggesting they should look deeper into the Shanghai venture. The effect was instantaneous and exactly what I anticipated. Mark was paranoid about insider trading and corporate espionage. These tiny, surgical information breaches confirmed his worst fears. He had a rat in his inner circle. He didn't suspect a scorned ex-husband. He suspected the ambitious VP who had been eyeing his corner office for years, or perhaps even the overly friendly bank manager who handled his offshore accounts. I watched Sarah's social media activity intensely, which was her unintentional emotional barometer. Her usual stream of arrogant, cheerful posts about their luxurious life started becoming defensive and erratic. She posted cryptic statuses about loyalty and snakes in the grass. The joy of their Caribbean trip was clearly overshadowed by internal suspicion. They were fighting, not with me, but with shadows I had meticulously placed in their minds. The foundation of their relationship, built on shared status and mutual financial ambition, was beginning to erode under the pressure of self-doubt. This was the beauty of the strategy. While they were busy fighting ghost enemies and scrutinizing expense reports, they were distracted from the bigger existential threat, the meticulously researched article that was ready to drop. I felt a surge of cold satisfaction. Their inability to conceive that I, the man they dismissed as a nobody, could orchestrate such a sophisticated attack was their fatal flaw. They had confused financial strength with intelligence, and now they were paying the price by destroying their own peace of mind. Christmas was still 2 weeks away, but Mark and Sarah were already experiencing a private, suffocating hell of suspicion and anxiety. The stage was set for the next critical act, bringing Amy back into the psychological equation. Bringing Amy back into the fold was the most delicate, critical phase. I wasn't going to tell her the truth directly, nor was I going to play the victim. I simply needed to plant a tiny seed of doubt, letting her intelligent mind process the unsettling discrepancy between Sarah's promises and their actions. My revenge was aimed at the adults. Amy was the collateral damage I needed to rescue, not manipulate. I decided to use an old, untraceable email account, one she knew I hadn't used for years but still checked occasionally. The message was concise, anonymous, and designed to look like a random corporate forward. The subject line was innocuous: FYI, Educational Fund Criteria Update. The body contained a redacted paragraph from Mark's holding company's internal document concerning long-term loyalty stipends. The paragraph clearly outlined that stipend continuance is contingent upon maintaining a specified distance from all competing influence networks. I didn't highlight anything. I didn't add a single word of commentary. I simply sent the email and logged out. A few days later, I saw the subtle shift. Amy had always been a prolific user of a niche, private photo sharing app we used to share pictures of the dog and family milestones. Normally, her posts were vibrant, full of her new life, the fancy events, the expensive gifts. But after my anonymous email, two posts appeared that were markedly different. One was a photo of her looking out of a window with a caption: "Sometimes the view is beautiful, but the glass feels too thick." The second was a highly filtered photo of her expensive new watch, but the caption read, "Does a gift still count as a gift if it feels like a transaction?" The emotional turmoil was evident. She was starting to feel the weight of the golden handcuffs. The realization that her new lifestyle was conditional, a payoff rather than genuine love, was starting to sink in. Sarah and Mark, consumed by their paranoia about the internal leak, were too self-absorbed to notice this quiet internal struggle. They were focused on counting their loyal allies, completely missing the fact that the person they valued most was beginning to question her own allegiance. This was exactly the leverage I needed. Amy wasn't running back to me yet, but her mind was now open. She was vulnerable not to my manipulation, but to the truth of her mother and Mark's calculation. I allowed myself a small, grim smile. The psychological warfare was working. Amy was questioning the cost of the ticket to the high life. Now it was time to move the battlefield to their most sacred ground, their annual Christmas gala. I needed a way in. I needed to see their downfall firsthand, and more importantly, I needed Amy to be there to witness it too. I needed to be at that gala. Delivering the devastating blow via email from my apartment was too passive. For the revenge to be complete, for it to truly destroy Mark's standing and Sarah's ego, it had to be delivered in person, under the harshest spotlight. I needed the audience, the gasps, and the immediate panic. The problem was I was permanently exiled from their social circle. Mark would sooner invite a tax auditor than me. I had to use a loophole, and thankfully Mark's desire to look perpetually popular was that loophole. I contacted Daniel, an old university friend who had maintained a casual business relationship with Mark over the years. Daniel was oblivious to the drama. He simply saw a chance to network. I arranged a dinner with Daniel casually, mentioning that Sarah and Mark had mended fences with me, implying we were on civil terms again. I then dropped a very subtle hint, suggesting I might skip their Christmas gala this year because I was planning a quiet family Christmas with my parents. This created the exact opposite effect. Daniel, wanting to look like a social connector, immediately called Mark's assistant and, in a fit of misplaced goodwill, insisted that Mark include me on the official guest list, framing it as a thoughtful gesture to show solidarity and maturity after the divorce. Mark, distracted by his paranoia over the phantom corporate leak, barely glanced at the request. He only saw a chance to look magnanimous in front of Daniel and their shared network. He probably thought my presence would just be a quiet, sad reminder of his victory. I received the engraved gold leaf invitation 3 days later. It felt like winning a private, wicked lottery. Now that my physical presence was secured, I shifted focus to the mechanism of the blow. The article, The Mark of Misdirection, was flawlessly written and hosted on a perfectly clean, anonymous offshore server, ready to be published instantly. The only thing I needed to carry was a small, elegant envelope. Inside, instead of raw files or a USB stick, I placed a custom made glossy card. On one side, it had a cryptic holiday message. On the other side, in tiny, elegant font, was the exact abbreviated URL to the expose. The brilliance was in the simplicity. Mark would receive an anonymous card, assume it was a tacky holiday greeting, and only notice the URL when he got home, or more likely later when the panic was already setting in. My final preparations were psychological. I spent an hour practicing my neutral, almost bored expression. I knew Sarah would try to bait me. I knew she would try to publicly establish her dominance. I had to be an immovable statue, letting her pathetic attempts bounce off me, saving all my energy for the final, precise strike. The day of the gala was 2 days away. The atmosphere inside Mark and Sarah's penthouse was thick with expensive perfume, faux sincerity, and Mark's underlying anxiety. The place was a monument to their mutual greed, all glass, chrome, and calculated opulence. Sarah, dressed in a blindingly expensive crimson gown, looked like the queen of her temporary kingdom. Mark, despite the tailored tuxedo, had a perpetually hunted look in his eyes. My small, targeted leaks had done their job well. I arrived precisely 20 minutes after the start, timing it for maximum visibility without having to linger uncomfortably. I was dressed simply but impeccably. My strategy was silence. I accepted a single glass of water, stood near the edge of the room, and observed. It didn't take long for Sarah to spot me. She broke off a conversation with a prominent local councilman, and her smile instantly turned into a predatory smirk. She approached me, her voice cutting through, the gentle orchestral music loud enough to draw attention. Well, well. Look what the tide dragged in, she cooed, touching my arm with a touch that felt more like a brand. I'm genuinely surprised you accepted the invitation, Dave. I thought you'd be too busy stringing lights on that tiny, pathetic pine tree you always insisted on getting. I looked her directly in the eye and held my neutral, practiced expression. Sarah, I replied, keeping my tone smooth and low. Your taste in Christmas decor has certainly improved. It's truly magnificent. And tacky, of course, but magnificent. I delivered the last part with a barely perceptible tilt of my head, acknowledging her insult but immediately dismissing it with a refined counter-observation. Her smile faltered. She had expected a wounded, defensive response, not effortless indifference. She tried again, shifting the focus to Mark. Mark, darling, come meet Dave. He's Amy's other father. He's sweet, but he simply couldn't keep up with our level of life. He's learning to accept that Amy deserves better than a 2-bedroom townhome. This was the punch she intended to land, but I wasn't fighting back with words. I waited until the attention was completely focused on me. Then I raised my water glass in a formal, measured toast, addressing not her, but the couple next to her. To Mark and Sarah, I said clearly, may you both find exactly what you deserve this holiday season. I believe you will, very soon. The ambiguity was unsettling. It sounded like a blessing to her friends, but to Mark, it sounded like a threat. Mark, his face pale, from weeks of worrying about corporate sabotage, nervously gripped Sarah's shoulder, sensing a deeper tension. Thank you, Dave, he muttered quickly, pulling Sarah away. The incident was over. They retreated, uneasy, thinking they had won the verbal skirmish, oblivious that the clock was ticking down to the final fatal second. I checked my phone discreetly. Amy had posted a new cryptic status. She was on her way to the party, unannounced. The final piece was falling into place. My timing had to be perfect. The moment arrived like a perfectly tuned clock striking midnight. Mark, feeling the pressure of hosting and perhaps the subtle anxiety I had instilled, decided to give a grandiose, self congratulatory toast. He stood beside Sarah, raising a crystal flute, ready to bask in the adoration of his wealthy peers. To prosperity, to success, and to the brilliant team that makes it all possible, he boomed, a fake smile plastered on his face. This was my window. I moved swiftly but without any sense of rush or aggression. My steps were measured, calm. I glided through the edges of the crowd, reaching Mark just as the applause began to die down. The timing was everything. Sarah saw me coming and her eyes narrowed in confusion and alarm. She tried to intercept me, but I didn't acknowledge her presence, focusing purely on Mark. The room fell into a curious silence. Everyone expected a petty argument. Another scene of the bitter ex-husband? Mark, I said, my voice level and quiet, forcing him to lean down slightly to hear me. I wanted to personally ensure you received my Christmas present. I held out the small, elegant envelope. It looked exactly like a formal holiday card from a high-end client. He took it automatically, his mind clearly still focused on his toast. Oh, thank you, Dave. Very thoughtful, he said dismissively, tucking the envelope into the inner pocket of his tuxedo without looking at it. He was already turning back to his guests. No, Mark. You should look at it now, I insisted, my voice still gentle but firm enough to command the attention of the surrounding few. Mark frowned, irritated by my persistence. He reluctantly pulled out the glossy card, his eyes scanning the cryptic holiday message on the front. Sarah, now standing rigid beside him, started to whisper a furious, "What are you doing?" I watched as Mark flipped the card. His face, already pale from worry, drained completely of color. The tiny, elegant URL to "The Mark of Misdirection" was staring back at him. It didn't look like a threat. It looked like a high-end, discreet invitation to ruin. "What is this?" Mark managed, his voice a low, strangled rasp. "That, Mark," I replied, standing tall and meeting his frantic gaze, "is exactly what you deserve. It's the truth about your shell companies, your off-market transactions, and how you built this whole magnificent empire on shifting sand. I made sure to use vocabulary, shell companies, off-market, that would resonate instantly with the investors and financiers standing nearby." Suddenly, a new sound cut through the murmurs of confusion, the clatter of a high heel on the marble floor. Amy stood near the entryway, holding a half-removed coat. She had arrived just in time, her eyes wide as she registered her mother's stunned face and Mark's frozen terror. Sarah finally lost control. "You absolute psycho!" she shrieked, lunging towards me. I simply stepped back, giving her hysteria the spotlight it craved. Mark grabbed Sarah's arm, his business instincts overriding her fury. He knew that the spectacle of a breakdown was far more damaging than the silence of a secret. His career, his reputation, his entire golden prison was imploding in real time in front of the people whose trust he needed most. "We need to go, now!" he barked at Sarah, dragging her towards the service elevator, leaving a wake of baffled, whispering guests and one very confused young woman. My gift was delivered. The auction was over. The silence after Mark and Sarah fled was profound, heavier than the music and chatter combined. Amy was still standing by the door, frozen. I knew this was the real climax, the moment I had to choose between being a vengeful ex-husband and a loving father. My heart didn't hesitate. I walked towards her, but not quickly, letting her process the scene. When I reached her, I didn't mention the chaos, the toast, or the shame. I simply took her coat. "It's cold outside," I said, my voice soft. "We should get you something warm to drink." Amy's eyes were glistening, but she wasn't crying. She was seeing clearly for the first time in months. "Dad, what was that? What did you give him?" "A mirror, sweetie." I gave him a clear look at his own reflection, I said, guiding her quietly away from the remaining gossiping crowd. We walked out onto the terrace. The city lights were sharp and cold, a perfect contrast to the warmth I wanted to generate. Mom said, "She said you were just bitter. She said this was about money and Mark giving me the future you couldn't afford," she whispered, her voice heavy with shame. "And what did you see tonight, Amy? Did you see a future based on love or one based on contracts and control? I don't have Mark's money, that's true, but I never needed to buy your presents. They sold your absence. That's the difference." She finally looked up at me. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I'm sorry about Christmas. They told me you didn't care about the traditions anymore, that you were moving on, and that I should too." I hugged her tight. It was the hug I had waited months for. "It's okay, Amy. It's all okay. You're here now. That's the only present I needed." The rest of the night was a blur of quiet resolution. Mark and Sarah's reputation was instantly in tatters. The anonymous article was detailed, factual, and most importantly, it was shared instantly among the city's elite, guaranteeing that Mark's carefully constructed facade would crumble without a single illegal act from me. He would face no prison time, but he would face something worse for him: professional ruin and social ostracism. I ended up having a small, perfect Christmas with Amy and my relieved parents. The joy in my mother's eyes when Amy walked through the door was the true reward. I realized my revenge wasn't about destruction. It was about reclaiming my life and my daughter from their toxic influence. After the holidays, I took the sharp focus and analytical skills I used on Mark and applied them to my own career. I launched a consultancy firm specializing in ethical competitive analysis, a poetic irony perhaps, and found immediate success. My life, once stagnant and shadowed by the divorce, became bright, motivated, and fully independent. Amy and I spent the new year looking for an apartment closer to her university, planning trips, and rebuilding our real, honest family tradition. The bitterness was gone. The win was sweet, and the future was wide open. I was finally the father she deserved, not the man they tried to diminish. So that's how I won back my Christmas and my daughter. It was brutal, calculated, and public. But they started the war by trying to buy my daughter's love. Tell me, did I do the right thing? What would you have done in my place? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to hear more twisted tales of revenge, life lessons, and true stories, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like.